So welcome back to Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John Dehlin. It is August 19th, 2019. And we are so thrilled to have back on Mormon Stories Podcast, Anthony Miller. And those of you who listen in sequence will have just listened to Anthony Miller's 4, 5, 6 hour, depending on how you count, interview. I lost track, but talking about navigating a Mormon faith crisis gracefully, as illustrated through his own story. Now we're going to shift gears, and we're going to share with you a presentation that Anthony gave at the Thrive Conference in June 2019. And let me just give a quick background. What is Thrive? Some friends came to me and said, "Hey, John, we need to create some events that sort of show progressive and post-Mormons how to heal and grow and find community and ultimately find joy after Mormonism. We don't need more presentations about Oliver Cowdery. We don't need more angry speeches. We just need a conference or spaces or events dedicated to joy or healing, growth, and community in post-Mormonism." So we organized the first Thrive Conference in June 2019. I invited some of my favorite people in the world to come present. Anthony made the cut. And, we've already shared Natasha Alford Parker's talk on sexuality, Christian Moore's talk on resilience, Margie Dehlin's talk on rebuilding a life or coming home. I shared a talk. We're going to be sharing Jeff and Chelsea Gardner's talk on Word of Wisdom 2.0. And there are some amazing talks like with David Bokovoy and others that we're just not going to share for whatever reason. Alan Mount and Katie, we did share their talk on mixed faith marriages. And you can go to MormonFaithCrisis.com or the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis podcast for all those episodes. We also co-release them on Mormon Stories. But this Thrive thing is going really well. We have another Thrive event planned for November 17th, 2019. We're super excited about that. Wayne Sermon, who's the lead guitarist of Imagine Dragons, is going to be keynoting that event. He's going to be talking about his feelings and thoughts around joy after Mormonism. He's amazing. We all have heard about Dan Reynolds. Maybe not enough of us have heard about Wayne Sermon. And he's a very deep thinker, thoughtful guy, and he's worth hearing from. So he's going to be speaking. We're also bringing Amber Scora, author of Leaving the Witness. She's, just like Tara Westover, kind of sweeping the world in popularity with her New York Times bestselling book, Leaving the Witness. We're bringing Amber Scora to Utah for the first time to speak at the Thrive Conference, but we've also got Stephanie Sorensen Larson from Encircle. We've got Christian back. We've got Natasha again. We've got Donna Showalter. She's going to be speaking. My dear friend Spencer Nugent. So many cool speakers on tap. Liz Dalton. We're going to have a great lineup for November 2019 Thrive. So go to Thrive Beyond Mormonism to register. We're pricing it at $15 a person. We are probably going to lose a crap ton of money on this event, but because we have great underwriters like Clint, at worst, we're going to break even to the huge financial loss of somebody. But Thrive isn't about making money. We've committed to that from the very beginning. Although I don't think there's anything wrong with sustainability, but we're probably going to lose a crap ton of money on Thrive. So $15 a person for like a full day of some of the greatest speakers you can think of in post-Mormonism. Think of it as like a post-Mormon general conference with talks you'd actually want to listen to and be inspired by and learn good things from. That's going to be a Thrive Day, November 17, 2019. So check it out. But with all that introduction, today we're going to have Anthony talk about his Thrive June 2019 presentation called Growing Beyond Grief, Loss, and Betrayal After a Mormon Faith Crisis. And he's got some slides to share with us. So Anthony, take it away.
Thank you very much. So you just read the title. So what I'm going to make sure and do is I'm going to read what's on the slides for the people that are listening in the podcast form as opposed to watching on YouTube. So the main slide is Growing Beyond Grief, Loss, and Betrayal. And the next slide is kind of the explanation for this session. And so I'll go ahead and read that. Among the most precarious and painful challenges of leaving the LDS faith include our experience to diverse stages of grief, along with a sense of loss and betrayal. The anger and depression stages of grief may not simply be bypassed. However, they aren't healthy places to reside long term. At the same time, a sense of self, community, and institutional loss and betrayal can leave us feeling stuck. This discussion-based Q&A session will discuss strategies to process and grow beyond grief, loss, and betrayal in healthy ways. So that's what we hope to accomplish in our discussion today. The next slide is a meme. I don't know who said it, but it's a pretty helpful meme. It's a black and white picture of a book that's opened up, and the meme says, "Forgive yourself for not knowing what you didn't know before you learned it." Forgive yourself for not knowing what you didn't know before you learned it. For a lot of us, when we're processing grief and a faith crisis, we have the experience of beating ourselves up. Why did it take so long for me to figure this out? Why was I 49 years old when I was ready to unpack Book of Abraham issues when I had been, introduced to it years and years before? Why did I do things or say things that would have been unhelpful and in my blind spots with regard to LGBTQ issues or women's issues or other kinds of things? So what I want to express is that we need to be gentle to ourselves, and we need to not hold ourselves hostage to our past, and forgive ourselves for the things that we did when we didn't know any better. So the next slide was the format of my presentation. The first thing I did is share my story, and then the second thing was to share resources and principles that helped me traverse personally grief and betrayal in ways that I felt that for me led to growth, peace, and confidence. And then we had a discussion led by questions of the members of the session. So for those of you that have watched my interview, and if you haven't watched my interview, I'll just kind of give you the brief summary. I grew up in the church. My parents joined when I was 3. The church provided a tremendous amount of benefit and privilege in my life. We were poor. The church supported me. I have ADD type tendencies. I don't have ADD, but I have tendencies naturally to ADD. And I ended up going on a mission. It helped me navigate and work through those in a way that helped me come back and go to school and be successful educationally and in a career. And I had significant opportunities to serve in the church as a straight white, never divorced male. Had opportunities to serve on the high council, high priest group leadership, and so forth. The church worked really, really well for me. And then about not quite 40 months ago, our then 22-year-old son came out to us as gay. And I had very, very heavy shelves, but I had a very strong sense of belief and certainty in the truthfulness of the church based on what I believed my spiritual experiences meant for me, that they were reliable divine witnesses of truth. And that evening in April of 2016, I went online to search for resources to support our gay son. And in doing that, I stumbled across the Gospel Topics essays, and then Mormon Think and Mormon Stories and the CES letter and Fair Mormon's debunking of it, and Jeremy's debunking of Fair Mormon's debunking and Fair Mormon's big long list of everything. And it was a pretty acute 3-day period that led into an extreme acute existential faith crisis. When my construct of spiritual experiences crumbled, several things happened. The first thing that happened is my construct of my spiritual experiences was how I knew and perceived God. And when I recognized that my construct of my spiritual experiences, being divine witnesses of truth, crumbled, my construct of God totally crumbled too. And so I experienced a sensation of the heavens closing, or it can also be referred to as a divine absence or God leaving the corner of the room where you once knew him. And it was an extremely acutely painful experience with significant grieving. And it opened me up to want to try to figure out how to make the church true again based on how it was true to me before. And the more I studied and the more I prayed and read scriptures and got blessings and counseled with my leaders who are my friends and tried to make traditional apologetic reconciliations work for me, it just didn't work. And so it was an extremely painful experience. It resulted in depression and disassociation, even one day of pretty significant suicidal ideation, because I couldn't understand why God would all of a sudden abandon me. It was an extremely painful experience. And as human beings, we, at least first half of life, using Richard Rohr's language, and it kind of equates to Eckhart Tolle's language as well, and secular Buddhism, is that we have this tendency to equate our identity to being our experiences. So as a man thinketh, so is he, kind of thing from the scriptures. And so a significant part of my identity was wrapped up in my constructs for God, my reputation and relationships in the church, my sense of values and meaning in life, and so forth. All this was wrapped up as part of my identity. And so for me, and I think the experience is not uncommon for a lot of people when they go through a faith crisis, at least if it's an acute faith crisis, it's not only a crumbling of loss of belief, it's a crumbling of sense of personal identity. And a lot of times when human beings, when we experience grief, it relates to, and again, I'm not a professional, like you have a PhD in this stuff. I don't. I'm just a financial planner that tries to figure this stuff out. So this is my personal experience and observation. But a lot of times when we experience severe grief, there seems to be this relationship to a loss or a threatening absence or something like that of our own identity. And so when we lose a loved one, that loved one was part of our identity, and we grieve the loss of not seeing that person again. But it's also extremely painful because that person's role in our life was a significant part of our identity, and that's crumbling too. And when we go through a faith crisis, one man that reached out to me after my interview last week, after watching it, he told me he's, I think it's 12 years ago. Yeah, 12 years ago, his father died. And then recently he went through a very, very painful divorce. And he told me that his faith crisis was more painful than those two things combined. That's how much grief he experienced. And fear of, this sense of that I'm the human being that I am because of what my father and my grandfather did and the stories that they told and the example that they had. And it was all in the constructs of the church. And so if I don't have that, like, how am I going to carry on that legacy? How am I going to be the kind of man that my father and grandfather have been to me, or that they were to me? How am I going to be that for my kids? All the above, fear of loss of relationships and so forth. So a faith crisis, in many cases, particularly if it's an acute, is a very significant grieving process that we go through. So as we negotiate these things, there's another slide that I'll read for you as well. And the slide is a guru, a dark-skinned guru, bearded, and he's speaking with a man in a suit with a white shirt and gray hair. And in this slide, the suited-up man asks the guru, what is the secret to eternal happiness? And the guru responds with, to not argue with fools. And in the next, underneath in the meme, the suited up man says, "I disagree," and the guru says, "Yes, you are right." Right.
So don't argue with fools.
Don't argue with, yeah. Not trying to be unkind to people, but it's generally not helpful as we're negotiating grief to try to argue with people. It's just generally just not helpful. People who perceive things or have different experiences that are quite differentiated than ours, without a tremendous amount of work, they're going to have a very hard time empathizing with the experience that we're having. And if they reconcile things differently than us based on their personality type and how they think about things and their experiences that they bring to the table, their propensity is to have a very hard time understanding and empathizing with what we're experiencing unless they put in a whole lot of work. The other thing that tends to happen with us is, for many of us, our past faith before faith crisis worked really well for us if we were a very linear black and white thinker. So things are right or wrong, or like in the Book of Mormon, everything's from God or it's from the devil, or President Hinckley saying either the first vision happened exactly as Joseph said it did, or it's a big fraud kind of thing. And so for people who are more black and white thinkers, the black and white messages that they received in Mormonism really worked for them. And if that's their propensity as to how they process things, if they go through a change of faith, their propensity to look at things from a black and white, linear, concrete thinking way doesn't necessarily change. It just flips to the other side. So instead of the church being true, now it's the devil kind of thing. And it just flips. And one thing that's unhelpful in the grieving process is to get in arguments with people when we're continuing in that same black and white thinking, just flipped on our experience. And it just results, in my experience, in more wounding. So in the next slide, I've mentioned a few of these things. I'll read the slide for the listeners on the podcast. The slide is titled "Contributors to Grief During a Faith Crisis." And the bullet points include, first, we have often experience a crumbling of our past constructs, of our identity, and I mentioned how important that is. We also experience a crumbling of past sense of trust. So we trusted our leaders, we trusted the material that we received in the correlated curriculum, and we trusted ourselves. And so sometimes we feel a violation of that trust. And when we experience a faith crisis or grief in a faith crisis, often we go and we seek help with expressions of vulnerability and seeking intimacy. And for people that don't have the capacity to sit with us in those experiences, that can also contribute to our grief, because we're going and we're grieving and we're angry and we're feeling depressed and we're feeling betrayed. And we're speaking with emotionally charged language because we're in the grieving process, and we're doing so with vulnerability, seeking intimacy and help. But sometimes that isn't met very well, and so that results in more grief in our faith crisis because we feel ostracized or abandoned. In the Thrive Conference, in the first evening, there was an exercise where people shared their stories, and the most painful stories, almost invariably, were feelings of being isolated from family and not trusted anymore, and people being accused of some great sin or being taken over by Satan or something like that. That loss of intimacy with people that we love in our family and our community is a significant contributor to grief in a faith crisis. The next bullet point is that we often sense institutional and self-betrayal and abuse, and we're processing those kinds of things to different degrees depending on our own individual experiences. A primary emotion of fear, the next bullet point, is that we fear a loss of relationships, community, roles, and reputation. Again, that goes back to our sense of identity in our first half of life, that our roles and reputation are part of our identity. We fear a loss of trust from others who don't reconcile things the same that we do. The next bullet point is our shame-based, conditioned ego voice, or our egoic voice, is often programmed to blame the loss of belief on ourselves. So it's our fault. If you experience a divine absence, if God leaves the corner of the room where you once knew him, if the heavens closed, it's your fault. You must have done something wrong. And so we struggle with that it might be our fault that we experience a divine absence. Oftentimes when we go and we seek help from defenders of the faith, our experience is often they blame us too. Like you've mentioned before, that it's a common thing for some of the defenders of the faith, or people that have had a totally different experience, so they have a blind spot for those who decided to follow the brethren and be in the mainstream of the church and not have gospel hobbies or study things on the periphery. They might say, Fawn Brody's book has been out. The Gospel Topics essays, they were started to be released in 2013. Rough Stone Rolling is out there. If you read different Mormon studies, journals, and so forth, all this information has been out there. It's your fault because you must have been lazy that you didn't know about this and that you feel betrayed by the institution for that. And that contributes to a sense of grief, and it feeds into the narrative that it's our fault that we're experiencing grief, and that's not helpful. The next bullet point is some people experienced deep trauma from the institution, from the culture and the teachings, without any compassion, acknowledgement, or apology from the perpetrators. And there are many examples, but I just give one example. For individuals who are LGBTQ, they might have experienced a sense of trauma either from the institution, the culture, or the teachings, and then they go through a faith crisis and they recognize that along the way there isn't any really sort of compassion, acknowledgement, or apology from the perpetrators of that abuse. And many people experienced this when the November 15, 2015 policy was reversed. It was just reversed with no acknowledgement of the effect that had on people. And so that contributes to grief. But there are other kinds of trauma that people experienced. And when there is no repentance or apology or acknowledgement or compassion from those that perpetrated abuse or harm or other kinds of trauma, then that contributes to grief. I've often heard this, and I said this myself as I was going through a faith crisis, is that sometimes it feels like I was the faithful spouse who was deceived and abused. Like I felt like I was faithful and I would have given everything to the church. I covenanted to give everything to the church, and I felt like I was the faithful spouse, but that I was abused. And whether or not that actually was the case, that's the experience, the lived experience of many people. And then finally on this slide, sometimes we experience, I mentioned this before, but sometimes poor treatment and gaslighting from the institution and the defenders of the faith that we would call apologists, who are supposed to have the answers. Sometimes we end up with poor treatment from those individuals or from the institution, and that contributes to ongoing wounding and a sense of trauma. So in the next slide, the title of the slide is Relational Differentiation. So as human beings during our lives, we experience differentiation of experiences because we all process things differently. And sometimes differentiation of experiences and how we reconcile things can be very painful and sometimes not very painful. So some examples of differentiation between in my story, my wife is an active Nuance Believing member, and I've resigned from the church. I'm no longer a member, so we've had that degree of differentiation. But there are kinds of differentiations that aren't painful. So, for example, music. She might enjoy totally different music than me, and that doesn't need to be painful. Usually isn't painful unless someone really hates country music and their spouse loves country music or something like that, or the kind of punk rock that Brian Whitney loves. Like, I love Brian Whitney, but I don't love his punk rock. I think it's pretty cool, but I can't listen to it. So, or we have differentiation of hobbies, So I have one friend whose wife loves crocheting and those other kinds of things and doing that as a shared together activity. And he wants to go jeeping and rock climbing in his rock buggy, and that's the hobby that he really likes. So we have this differentiation. Another differentiation that can be very tender until we figure it out is the 5 love languages. So the 5 love languages is a model to explain how we express and receive expressions of emotional intimacy. And I won't go into a significant amount of detail, but just to say that for some people, love and emotional intimacy has to do with attentive physical touch. For some people, it has to do with shared quality time activities together and listening. For some people, love and emotional intimacy is manifest through acts of service that we give to other people. For some people, love and emotional intimacy has to do with the attentiveness behind gift giving, not the economic value of the gift, but the thoughtfulness behind the gift. And for some people, love and emotional intimacy has to do with words of affirmation, kind and affirming words, and so forth. So generally, for some reason, we tend to marry people that have different primary love languages than us the majority of the time, although there are some couples that get lucky enough to marry someone that speak the same primary love language as they do. And so at some point, if we're going to navigate a marriage, we have to figure out that love and emotional intimacy mean something different to my spouse than I do. And so if I want to connect with my spouse, what I need to do is learn how to be fluent in that love language. And maybe I have children that have different love languages than me. So if I want to emotionally connect with my children, I need to become multilingual in the 5 love languages, and I need to learn how to express love and emotional intimacy to my children in what love and emotional intimacy means to them. That kind of relational differentiation doesn't need to be painful.
Doesn't need to be, but it can be.
Until we figure it out.
If somebody insists on giving in ways that the other doesn't experience as love, it can be super painful because, in effect, people don't feel loved even if their partner's trying to love them in a way that doesn't speak to them. So... but it's important to figure out, but it doesn't need it.
It can be very, very painful.
If someone needs touch, but all they get is gifts and they don't care about gifts, but they want touch. The gifts can be given all day. The giver thinks they're amazingly generous. And the receiver is like, I just want you to touch me.
Just hold me.
Just hold me.
Just hold me as I'm waking up in the morning.
Or other things.
Or slap my behind when I'm walking down the hall.
Or make passionate love to me.
Absolutely. Right. So there are many different kinds of things. And so, absolutely can be painful. But differentiation in a faith a relational differentiation in a faith crisis situation can be extremely painful. And so the story that I told at this point in the presentation is I could have a neighbor who's a Jehovah's Witness, and that neighbor who's a Jehovah's Witness, in their devotion to the divine, they might believe that God wants them to not celebrate birthdays and holidays. And while that wouldn't be how I experience devotion to the divine, I could almost see some beauty and faithfulness in that person's devotion to the divine through something that feeds them and means something to them. Whereas if my wife and I are active believing members of the church and we get married in the temple and we have this common shared story and narrative of what our expectations are about life and how divinity works and our connection to God works, and then at some point along the way, my wife goes through a faith transition, and she converts to the Jehovah's Witness faith. And before this happened, a significant amount of our family history and our story and our sense of spiritual connection was significantly tied to birthdays and holidays and the shared experiences that we had in those things. Maybe even if my primary love language was quality time. And so I had emotional connection, not just spiritual connection, with birthdays and holidays. And if my wife goes through a change of faith and becomes a Jehovah's Witness, and then she subsequently comes to me and she says, you know what, in my sense of devotion to God now, I can't participate anymore in birthdays and holidays. That can be an extremely painful sense of differentiation. Number one, because it might feel like she's depreciating what we had as shared spiritual language that was very treasured to us, and now it feels like she's abandoned that or left that. Number two, that might be very painful because I might think, well, if she can all of a sudden, out of nowhere, change her beliefs about God, maybe she can change her beliefs about me, and her relationship to me. And what if I don't come to the same belief system as her? Like, is she going to leave me for a Jehovah's Witness spouse? And so that can be very painful and threatening. And so that can be extremely painful, that kind of relational differentiation. And so that is part of a contributor to the grieving process. As we're going through this with regard to relational differentiation, the next bullet point on the slide is that we need to consider individual autonomy and authenticity versus systemic integrity and authenticity. So an example of that is I might have had a particular experience in Mormonism of and a particular reconciliation of what the temple meant, and then gone through a faith crisis and come to a different belief of what the temple means and where it came from. And it might all of a sudden become a very traumatic thing for me to consider the temple. But if my active believing wife still finds spiritual value and connection, and she thrives in her participation in the temple, that differentiation can be tough if I impute my experience on her. So if my experience of trauma with regard to those symbols or participation of those things, and then she goes and participates in them, that can be very painful from an individual standpoint, unless I come to the reconciliation or realization that we can have different meanings for symbols, and I'll share stories with regard to that. And the second thing can be that if I imputed a particular meaning on the temple, and in terms of consecrating everything to the church and sustaining the brethren, all those kinds of things, I might perceive that my wife's participation in the temple is a manifestation of those very same things that I believed. And her experience might be totally different than that. And so a lot of the differentiation-based pain can be that we're imputing our experience or perception of what things mean, of what symbols mean, on our spouse, when our spouse might not even be holding those meanings for those symbols. It might be totally different than ours was or than ours is now. And that can be very different. And so it can help in the grieving process to trust that our spouse can have a different experience, or our loved ones can have a different experience, and that what those experiences mean for them might be different than what they used to mean for us or what they mean for us now.
Another example I get is I've had several women come to me in faith crisis when their husbands get called as bishop, because they have their feminist awakening and all of a sudden are really angry about the patriarchy. And then their husband sort of assumes the chief position in the congregation or in the ward as head of the patriarchy. And it can be catastrophically traumatic to a woman in that situation. Yeah. And then how do you fall away as the bishop's wife? and the bishop can be bishop not because they want to support the patriarchy, but because they want to help the LGBT kid who otherwise would be marginalized, or the masturbating pre-missionary that might otherwise be shamed and kept from a mission. So it's important to go deeper to understand people's motives and framing, because you can be bishop or whatever, go to the temple for very different reasons.
That is an excellent and amazing example, because that bishop, the symbol of that calling and what he does might be totally different than her experience of what that is. Right. And he might be doing actually some amazingly good things.
Crucial things.
Yeah. Change people's lives.
Saving lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so in any event. So the next bullet point in this slide is that research suggests that relationships that are able to most effectively differentiate utilize the following skills. So there are 3 skills listed. The first is patience. So we need to have patience with ourselves and with others, because there are going to be some stumbles along the way. and we just need to hold space that's going to be messy, right? The second thing is curiosity. It's helpful to get curious, because that's how we begin to understand who others are as individuals. And so in the example that you gave with regard to the wife that goes through a feminist awakening that triggers a faith crisis, and the husband who's not a super literal black and white person that's doing amazing things as the bishop, the only way that they're going to be able to increase their comfort level with differentiation of their experiences, they need to get curious about each other's experiences, right? So the bishop needs to understand that he has blind spots, that he might not fully appreciate what his wife is experiencing. And so he needs to get curious in her experiences, and he needs to get curious about what feeds her and about what wounds her. And on her side, if she wants to nourish the relationship as well, she needs to get curious about her husband's experience, and trust that if he says, this is how I process or view this thing, that it could be different than what she does. And so that can be helpful. And then the third thing is that we need to have a willingness to tolerate tension. We need to tolerate tension because things will get tense when we bring up differences. So sometimes we need to have safe words, in our family. My brother-in-law, I told him this, so this won't be bad. Our safe word in our family is Uncle Joe. So I love my brother-in-law, but somehow when our kids were younger, if we would tickle them or tussle them or whatever, somehow Uncle Joe became the safe word, So if we were tussling as a family, or we're having a conversation that was, I hope we're not taking Joe, your name, in vain. But if we come across something and we needed a safe word, we had a safe word. It was Uncle Joe. It was like, I need a timeout, I need a boundary, or whatnot. So whatever your safe word is, whatever you need to set boundaries, those are going to be helpful with regard to relational differentiation. Conversations like asking my active, nuanced believing wife, as I was going through my faith crisis, what was your biggest fear? And for her to be able to express to me, this was my biggest fear when I went through this. And for her to get curious and ask what was my greatest fear as I was going through my faith crisis. Being able to have those kinds of conversations, and then setting boundaries. And so for human beings, Brene Brown talks about boundaries. As human beings, in order to have a safe place with the people that we love, we do need to set boundaries and express that if you went beyond this boundary, it would feel like a betrayal of trust, or it'd feel like something was happening that wasn't a safe thing for me. And so for my wife and I think she'll be fine if I share this. For my wife and I, when we were talking about negotiating boundaries, my wife's boundaries was for me to not do things that would crash our daughter's testimony, to overwhelm her with uncorrelated church material or something. And my wife needed me to respect that boundary for my wife to feel safe. And likewise, interestingly enough, my boundary for my wife is I needed her to not do things or sustain things that I felt would harm our gay son and his partner. And so those were examples of boundaries that we set. But we have to be patient with each other, because sometimes there's going to be tension. Sometimes we're going to encounter things that are going to cause tension with regard to differentiation without realizing, oh, that is a boundary. We need to establish that as a boundary so that we can feel safe where we're at. And then I shared in my Mormon Stories interview that as I was processing my faith crisis, there was a period of time that I felt like, since my wife was my person, that if I was venting about or processing, things that I was stumbling across that were very upsetting to me, that I needed to be able to discuss these things with her and process these things with her. And at times that led to wounding conversations between the two of us, either because she wasn't ready to talk about those things, or she processed those things differently, even having studied the same information as me. And so sometimes it ended up in wounding conversations that weren't helpful. And early on, as I was processing grief, she said, I trust that this is your experience. I know you're hurting. What I need you to do is, I know you need to vent about and process these things. So I need you to go find places and people and groups where you can process these things and vent about these things, so that when you're with me, you can be with me. And so setting those kinds of boundaries can be actually quite helpful. All right, so moving on to the next slide. As we're processing grief, and I would mention at this point that we all process grief, and it's not Satan. Everyone listening or watching is going to have a loved one die. Everyone watching is going to die someday. And we're all going to have things in our life that are going to trigger grief. And grief is part of life. And we need to get good at processing grief. We need to be aware of why we're experiencing grief. What can we learn from that grief? What are the support resources that we can access to help us process grief? To recognize that if we try to skip stages of grief, all we're going to do is delay healing. And if we place ourselves in a situation, so for example, if you take somebody who's in a faith crisis and they're in an acute faith crisis, but they're wanting to avoid processing the anger and depression stages of grief because it makes them uncomfortable, and the narrative is that if that discomfort is Satan, then that's what's contributing to their faith crisis. And so they're trying to avoid to skip this processing and traversing the stages of grief at the same time that they're continually getting re-wounded, and they're feeding themselves the narrative that it's their fault that this is happening and it's their responsibility to fix it, and they have a divine absence because of something they did somehow. They can remain in an acute faith crisis for a really long time, and that's extremely destructive. And so we need to recognize that that is not healthy. And so in any event. All right. So in this slide, the title of the slide is Common Emotions That Surface When We're Processing Grief. The first emotion is fear, and I mentioned that a little bit before. Fear is a primary emotion. A secondary emotion that comes out of fear is anger. And so a lot of times when we're interacting with our loved ones and we're going through a faith crisis and they're not, and we're expressing anger or they're expressing anger to us, really that's coming from a place of fear. And it's helpful to recognize that that's the case, that maybe our loved one isn't necessarily angry with us or hates us or has got to a point where they don't love us anymore, but really they're coming from a place of fear, or we're coming from a place of fear, and that's manifesting itself in anger. And the next bullet point under fear is that by our very evolution, we are hardwired for connection. And that connection that we have with other human beings is what we needed to survive. And I feel like it's what we continue to need to survive and thrive. And one of the biggest fears is loss of that human connection. If my wife went through a change of faith and became a Jehovah's Witness and didn't want to celebrate birthdays and holidays anymore, a significant part of that grieving process and fear would be a sense of loss of connection, because we don't have that shared spiritual experience of holidays and birthdays and so forth, and our ancestral history that's all tied up in those kinds of experiences. So other emotions that surface in the bullet points on this slide are a sense of betrayal, personal betrayal, institutional betrayal, a sense of shame, like we should have figured this out before, we're not gentle with ourselves, we hold ourselves hostage to our past experiences, a sense of loss of identity, loss of community, and so forth. And then we experience multiple grief cycles as we revisit or find new things to unpack. And so a lot of times what I've observed is when people process grief of a faith crisis, they maybe feel that if I just resign or if I just do this, then I won't have this grief anymore. And that's not how it works. The stages of grief aren't linear. We get to retraverse things, and we get new things to grieve. And so, I remember my initial acute phase, and then a couple of weeks later, unpacking Doctrine and Covenants 132 and then grieving the reconciliation that my marriage had nothing to do with the NC 132 and eternal marriage. And then I remember my first Christmas and my first Easter, as I was unpacking these things, I had new things to grieve. And so we need to be tender with ourselves and recognize that we're going to encounter new things to grieve. Even you, having gone through this for, more than a decade, you're going to find new things to grieve from time to time. And we just need to realize that this is part of life. It's part of the process.
One emotion I would add that for me is very core and primary is just sadness. Just being sad.
Yeah.
Sad that things aren't like they were, sad that, you don't have the same maybe things in your life, sad that the dream that was so beautiful in so many ways died. I think along with fear, sadness are the two main emotions I identify.
I totally experience those things, and we experience those things when a loved one dies.
Yeah.
Right. And we experience these things when we have other things to grieve that are loss of connection, identity, and whatnot.
Yeah. I always say I didn't leave the church. Well, I didn't leave it. They kicked me out, but I didn't leave it because I hated it or it had mistreated me in some fundamental way. I super loved it.
Right.
I was into it.
Yeah.
And so I still, to this day, people get mad or don't understand, but I still miss it.
Yeah.
I miss a lot about it.
Well,
I do.
I mean, you and me too.
Yeah.
It worked for us.
Yeah.
We came from a place.
Yeah. Our privilege was a big part of that.
Our privilege was a big part of it. We had all these blind spots of people experiencing trauma. And even though we experienced trauma, it was totally different than the trauma that they might have experienced. So.
And I missed, and I feel like I got better about those blind spots, and that's what developed the tension. But even as I was suffering for LGBTQ people and women and people of color, and even as I was still attending and suffering for those people, I was still enjoying it. And I felt guilty about enjoying it.
Yeah.
Because the church is kind of made for guys like us.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's helpful for me, but then I feel guilty because it's harming people. It's like if you have it's not Uncle Joe, because Uncle Joe doesn't hurt people. It's not you, Joe. But if you have that uncle that is doing things and you dearly love this person, but you disagree with them, and I don't disagree with Joe, there's tension in that relationship. Yeah. That people that you love, that an organization in terms of the community and the experiences in that community that you love are also harming people who you love. That's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
So we recognize that there's grief, and so the question is, we sit through it, and what are some of the helpful things in order to be able to process grief? And so on the next slide, what I have, and so we're going to jump back and forth between two slides. The next slide that I have, the title of the slide is Nourishing Spiritual and Emotional Intimacy, as part of healing and growing through a faith crisis. And so the first bullet point question on that slide is to ask, what are the things that feed you spiritually and or help you sit in the present and recognize that your egoic voice is not who you are? Basically, what are the things, not the shame-based voice, not the conditioned voice that says it's your fault and you have to fix this and you should feel guilty and all these kinds of things. What are the things that help us to pull ourselves into the present, to be, to sense spiritual connection, to grow, and to give us some relief from the sense of grief. And people have a number of different things that help them. So music, there's certain violin solos, and classical music that totally bring me into the present of the emotion of the music. I had my faith crisis playlists, that I listened to over and over again, like the Mumford and Sons one, or Tyler Glenn's album came out, or Mindy Gledhill's, album, or Angela Soph, her album. These can be helpful things. Music can help bring us into the present. There are a number of different activities that can bring us into the present. I won't say it right, but there's is it ecstatic dancing or something like that? Anyway, there's dancing that people do the effect is it just brings you totally into the present moment. There are a lot of different activities, and it seems that if we can find things that feed us, whether you want to call it spiritually or elevation emotion or whatever it is that you want to call it, a sense of connection with individuals, nature, and with yourself, those kinds of things can help you as you're processing grief.
And they're core in human needs.
These are core human needs.
Yeah, you need uplift.
Yeah.
And energy and flow.
Yeah.
And if you don't replace what the church used to provide, you're going to stay not well. You know, you got to get that.
Yeah, I didn't insert this slide, although I'll talk about it a little bit. In our Sunstone presentation, Janice Spangler and Sarah Zabawa and I did a Sunstone presentation just this year on post-Orthodox spirituality and growth. And we had 2 slides where in the first slide, we listed an example of all the things that spiritually fed us or connected us when we were Orthodox members. So fasting and hymns and service to others and reading and pondering sacred text, like the scriptures, and contemplative experiences that are either individual or together, like going to the temple or prayer or whatnot. If you sat down and made a list of all the things that gave you a sense of spiritual connection while you were an Orthodox believer, then the next slide was a list of things that could give us a sense of spiritual connection post-Orthodoxy. And the irony is there were a lot of similarities. So music, reading and contemplating sacred texts or thought leaders, Brene Brown, whatever, things, or sacred texts from other traditions, service to others. For some people, they find divinity in spending time in nature or fasting. Maybe if prayer is no longer a helpful practice for them, maybe meditation and mindfulness practices. So if we go back and we do an inventory of the things that really helped us and spiritually fed us when we were Orthodox believers, sometimes what we can do is we can find that there are kind of some mirrored types of activities that would be helpful for us that have a tie to what those things were and why they were helpful for us, and we can adapt those things and get creative into how they can help us post-Orthodoxy. So, in any event. So the next bullet point on this slide is to ask the question, what are the individual and shared values and activities that feed you? And at this point, I'm going to jump forward a slide to a spiritual values exercise. And I didn't do this during the session, but I referred to it. So on this slide, I'm not going to read all of them, but what I will do is Sarah Hughes Zabawa, I co-presented with her in this session on post-Orthodox growth and spirituality. She's placing this into a single-page PDF spiritual values exercise. She'll have her contact information on it and so forth, and she'll upload it and host it on her website, and I'll link to it on mine for people that want to go through this exercise. So for the listeners, what this slide is a list of a number, 4 columns of a list of different spiritual values that might feed you or give you a sense of meaning and connection. And I'll read through some of them, like honesty, openness, willingness, hope, commitment, courage, humility, unconditional love, awareness, vigilance, self-discipline, trust, responsibility, positive thinking, kindness, compassion, selflessness, contemplation, abundance, calmness, charity, curiosity, empathy, ethics, inclusiveness, happiness, growth, grace, generosity, loyalty, making a difference in other people's lives, open-mindedness. So in the spiritual values exercise, what we'd do first is we'd have you go through and circle all the ones that have a fairly strong connection to you. And then the second part of the exercise is to go through and identify the top 3. And the reason that we choose 3 is the studies show that if people make this super long mission statement or like have this value statement with like a huge list of all these different values, there's dilution that happens and a loss of focus. And if we can narrow down to our primary things and focus on those, some of the other values that connected to us will participate in those things as a byproduct of our primary ones. So if I were to go through this, gratitude, making a difference in others' lives, and then I would add a sense of integrity or authenticity, that I'm the same person in private than I am in public. And so those would be my three: gratitude, making a difference in other people's lives, which could include service, and my sense of what integrity means. Those are my three. And my spouse could go through this, and she might choose, I don't know if she would choose these things, but loyalty might be one of them, and she might have three ones that are separate from me. So the purpose of this exercise, number one, is to identify what are the things that really feed you, and then to recognize that activities that are related to your core spiritual values or your core values of meaning, purpose, and life, activities related to those are going to be the things that spiritually feed you or help you grow and sense connection. And then if your spouse or loved one can go through the exercise, if you can understand, identify what your spouse's three core values are, number one, it might be pretty cool if you have some things in common, right? So that you can have shared spiritual languages or values or practices. But number two, this goes to the curiosity of being able to support each other in differentiation of belief and spiritual practices, to recognize that my spouse's three primary core spiritual values might be different than mine, and that I could see that she's fed in those things and I can support her in those things, and that she could see that mine are different than hers and she can support me in those things. So just like my wife knows that love and emotional intimacy for me is for her to slap me on the behind when I'm walking down the hall and hold me when I'm waking up in the morning, or run and jump into my arms when I come home, because physical touch is my primary love language. She could also recognize that if my core spiritual values had to do with gratitude, making a difference in other people's lives, and a sense of integrity and authenticity, then she can hold space for what mine are. And then the next step in this is then, with those closest relationships that you have, to go through and work and find what shared spiritual languages might be. And there might be some commonality with your top three, or there might be other ones that are further down on your list, but there are things that you can share. So in any event, like I said, for the listener, Sarah's going to create a PDF with this exercise so that you can do it individually with your loved one in your family and talk about shared values.